I want to tell you a story. It will change your understanding of simple things, like the thought that flits through your mind before sleep or the shadow of doubt that trails you on a sunny day. This is a story about how a man learned to control his mind before it could control him, and it begins with silence, the kind that frightens us most of all. There was a man named Michael. He was just past 30, and to anyone watching, he seemed ordinary. He worked at a small factory where they made parts for machines no one ever saw finished. Each day, he'd rise before the sun, pull on a worn jacket, and walk the 3 miles to his job. His hands were steady, his step sure, but inside him, something trembled. It wasn't fear, not yet, just a quiet rustling like leaves stirred by a wind he couldn't name. You see, Michael lived in a world of noise, the clatter of metal at the factory, the hum of the streets, the chatter of voices that filled every empty space. But at night, when the world grew still, he'd sit in his tiny room, a single lamp flickering, and listen to the silence. And that silence wasn't empty. It was alive, heavy with questions he couldn't answer. Why did he feel so restless? What was this ache that gnawed at him, even on good days? Most of us know that silence. It's the moment when the distractions fall away and we're left alone with ourselves. That's where the real story begins, not in the noise, but in what whispers beneath it. One evening, after a long shift, Michael sat by his window, staring at the stars. They were faint, dulled by the city's glow, but they were there. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his tired face, and took a slow drag. His mind wandered, as it often did, to the life he hadn't lived, the dreams he'd buried somewhere along the way. "What's the point?" he muttered to no one, and that's when it happened. A single thought, sharp and unbidden, pierced the haze. "You're not in control." It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but it felt alive, like a seed lodging itself in soft earth. He froze, the cigarette trembling between his fingers. Now let's pause here for a moment. Have you ever noticed how a single thought can change everything? It's not the big moments that shape us most, it's the quiet ones, the ones we barely see coming. Michael didn't know it then, but that thought was the beginning of something. A seed doesn't announce itself with fanfare, it simply settles in and waits. And so it was with him. He could have brushed it aside, drowned it in the noise of tomorrow's work, but something in him held on. That's the first lesson of the mind. What you ignore doesn't disappear, it grows. Days passed, and that thought lingered. At the factory, as he tightened bolts and stacked parts, it whispered to him. On his walks home, it followed like a shadow. "You're not in control." He began to notice things he'd never seen before, the way his hands moved without thinking, the way his feet carried him down the same path every day. It was as if he'd been sleepwalking through his own life. One afternoon, standing by a rusted machine, he caught his reflection in a cracked window. His eyes were dull, his jaw tight. "Who's running this show?" he asked himself. The question wasn't loud, but it echoed inside him. You and I, we're not so different from Michael. We build routines, fill our hours, tell ourselves we're in charge, but the mind is a garden, and if you don't tend it, something else will take root. For Michael, that something had been growing for years. Doubt, habit, a quiet resignation. He'd let it spread because he hadn't known better, but now that seed of a thought was stirring something new. Awareness. It's a small thing, awareness, but it's the first step to anything worthwhile. Without it, you're just a passenger in your own head. One night, restless and unable to sleep, Michael stepped outside. The air was cool, the streets empty. He walked without direction, letting his feet choose the way. After a time, he found himself by a small park, a patch of green he'd passed 100 times but never entered. He sat on a bench, the wood cold against his legs, and closed his eyes. For once, he didn't fight the silence. He let it settle over him like a blanket. And there, in that stillness, he felt it again. You're not in control. But this time it wasn't a taunt. It was a question. Who was in control? His habits? His fears? The life he'd let happen to him? He opened his eyes and the world seemed sharper. The stars were still faint, but they burned a little brighter. A breeze rustled the trees, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Not because anything had changed, but because he'd asked the question. That's the climax of this first chapter, my friend. Not a battle or a shout, but a man on a bench, waking up to himself. The seed had taken root, and though he didn't know it yet, the garden of his mind was about to change. Let me draw you back into this story with a question. Have you ever walked a path so often that you forgot why you started? That's where we find Michael now, a man who just tasted the edge of something real, only to stumble into the tangle of his own making. You see, the mind doesn't give up its reins easily. It's a stubborn thing, rooted deep in what's familiar, and Michael was about to learn that the hardest weeds to pull are the ones you've watered yourself. The morning after his night in the park, Michael woke with a strange lightness. The air felt crisper. The coffee in his chip mug tasted richer. That question, who's in control, still hummed in his chest like a distant song. He decided to walk a different way to the factory, just to see what would happen. Instead of the usual gray streets, he turned down a lane lined with old trees, their branches heavy with leaves. The world seemed to wink at him, as if it had been waiting for him to look. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of curiosity. It's a small thing, curiosity, but it's the spark that lights a fire. And Michael's fire had been cold too long. At the factory, though, the noise swallowed him again. The clanging machines, the barked orders, the rhythm of routine, it all rushed in like water over a cracked dam. He tightened bolts, stacked parts, nodded at the same faces. By noon, that lightness was fading, and by evening it was gone. On his walk home, back down the familiar gray streets, he felt the weight settle in again. That's the thing about the mind. It loves what it knows, even if what it knows is a cage. Michael had glimpsed freedom, but habit was pulling him back and he didn't even see the ropes. Let's linger here a moment. Habit is a quiet thief. It doesn't announce itself with a flourish. It just moves in one step at a time until you're living a life you never chose. Michael's days had become a script. Wake, work, walk, sleep, and he'd played the part so long he'd forgotten he was the actor, not the stage. But that seed from the night before, that question, it was still there, buried under the weeds. And seeds, even small ones, have a way of pushing through. Days turned into weeks, and Michael slipped back into his old rhythm. The park faded to a memory, the new path forgotten. Yet something nagged at him. At night, when the silence crept in, he'd catch himself staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks he'd never noticed before. You're not in control. The thought returned, softer now, but persistent. One evening, tired of fighting it, he grabbed a pencil and an old notebook from a drawer. He hadn't written anything since he was a boy, but his hand moved anyway. He scribbled, "What am I doing then? Why am I doing it?" The words stared back at him, simple and raw. That's when he saw it, the first weed. It wasn't the factory or the walk or even the silence. It was the way he let each day blur into the next without asking why. He'd been living on autopilot, letting habit steer while he slept at the wheel. The pencil trembled in his hand as he wrote one more line. "I don't want this." And there it was, a crack in the soil, a tiny rebellion against the life he'd accepted. You see, my friend, the mind doesn't change with grand gestures. It changes with questions, little pricks of light that pierce the dark. The next day, Michael did something small but deliberate. At the factory, instead of eating alone in the corner, he sat with a man named Ivan, a wiry fellow with gray hair and quick hands. Ivan had been there 20 years, and his eyes carried stories. "Why do you stay?" Michael asked, surprising himself. Ivan grinned, wiping grease from his fingers. "Habit, I suppose, and the pay's steady." Michael nodded, but inside he felt a jolt. Habit. There it was again, that weed choking the garden. He didn't say more, just ate his bread and listened to Ivan talk about his fishing trips. But the whole time his mind churned. Is that me in 20 years? We all have our Ivans, mirrors that show us what we might become if we don't tend the soil. Michael wasn't better than Ivan, nor worse. He was just awake now, and that's a painful gift. Awareness doesn't let you hide. It shines a light on the weeds and hands you the shovel. What you do next? Well, that's the test. For Michael, the test came faster than he expected. That night, he sat with his notebook again. The lamp flickered, casting shadows on the wall. He wrote about the factory, the walk, the years he'd let slip by. Each word felt like pulling a root from the ground. Hard, messy, but freeing. Then he stopped, pencil hovering. A memory surfaced, sharp and unbidden. His father, years ago, sitting in a chair much like this one, staring at nothing. "Don't end up like me," his father had said once, voice rough with a regret. Michael had been too young to understand. Now he did. His father had lost the garden to weeds, and they'd strangled him slow. He set the pencil down, heart pounding. The room was still, but inside him a storm raged. "I don't want this." The words from the page burned in his chest. He stood, walked to the window, and looked at the stars. Faint, but there. That was the climax of this chapter, not a shout or a fight, but a man facing the weeds he'd grown and choosing for the first time to pull them. He didn't know how, not yet, but the decision was made. And in the garden of the mind, a decision is a blade sharper than any tool. What if the ground you stand on isn't as solid as you think? That's the question Michael woke to, though he didn't know it yet. He'd pulled the first weeds from his mind, habit, resignation, the dull rhythm of days, but beneath them was something deeper, something he hadn't dared touch. This is where our story turns, my friend, because the mind isn't just a garden, it's the soil itself, and sometimes you have to dig to find what's holding you back. The morning after his night with the notebook, Michael felt different, not lighter exactly, but restless. The air in his room was stale, the walls too close. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside before the sun was up. The streets were quiet, the world still asleep, and he walked without a plan, letting the cool air wake him. He passed the factory, its dark shape looming, and kept going until he reached the edge of town. There, by a field stretched wide and empty, he stopped. The earth was bare, waiting for spring, and it struck him. His life felt like that field, unused, unplanted, just sitting there. You see, we all have fields inside us, spaces where something could grow if we dared to turn the soil. Michael had spent years walking past his, eyes down, hands busy with someone else's work. But that morning, standing by that field, he felt a tug. What's beneath? Not the ground under his feet, but the ground inside him. He'd asked who was in control, he'd seen the weeds, but now came the harder question. What had he buried there beneath the surface to keep himself so still? He turned back, the walk home slower now, thoughtful. At the factory, the day unfolded as always, metal clanging, sweat on his brow, but his mind was elsewhere. During a break, he watched Ivan again, the man's hands moving with the ease of 20 years. "Ever think about leaving?" Michael asked. Ivan shrugged. "Where would I go? This is what I know." Michael nodded, but the words stuck. This is what I know. How many times had he said that to himself? How many times had he let it be enough? Let's pause here because this is where the story deepens. The mind loves a familiar plot, safe, predictable, no surprises. But safety is a trap when it keeps you from growing. Michael wasn't unhappy, not in the loud, obvious way, he was just there. And that's the soil most of us settle into, a quiet comfort that hardens over time. To break it, you have to dig, and digging hurts. Michael didn't know what he'd find, but that seed from the park, that restless question, was pushing him to try. That night, he sat with his notebook again. The lamp glowed steady, and he wrote, "What am I afraid of?" The question came out fast, almost before he meant it to. He stared at the page, pencil still. Fear. He hadn't named it before, but there it was, like clay beneath the weeds. He thought of his father again, those tired eyes, that regret. Then other memories came, a boyhood dream of building things, not just parts, but whole machines. A teacher who'd told him he was clever. A plan to leave town once before the factory claimed him. Where had those gone? Buried, he realized, under years of "this is what I know." The mind is a funny thing. It hides what scares you, not to protect you, but to keep you still. Michael's fear wasn't failure, it was change. He'd stayed put because moving meant risk, and risk meant facing himself. But now, with the notebook open and the silence pressing in, he couldn't hide anymore. He wrote again, "I'm afraid of what I could be." The words felt heavy, true, and truth, my friend, is the shovel that breaks the soil. The next day, something shifted. At the factory, a machine jammed, a big one, spitting sparks and grinding to a halt. The foreman cursed, but Michael stepped forward. "Let me look," he said, surprising himself. He'd fixed smaller things before, but this was different. His hands moved, steady and sure, tracing wires, tightening bolts. The others watched, Ivan included, as he worked. After an hour, the machine hummed back to life. The foreman clapped his shoulder, gruff but impressed. "Didn't know you had that in you," he said. Michael smiled, faint but real. "Neither did I." That moment wasn't about the machine, it was about the soil. For years he'd let it harden, convinced nothing good could grow. But there, with grease on his hands and a spark in his chest, he felt it give. Capability. It had been there all along, buried under fear and habit. We all have it, you know, some gift, some strength waiting to be uncovered. The trick is trusting it's there even when the ground feels solid. That night, Michael didn't write. He sat by his window, the stars clearer now, and let the silence fill him. He thought of the field, the machine, the boy he'd been. Then, unbidden, a new question rose: what could I grow here? Not in the notebook, not in the factory, but in himself. It wasn't an answer, it was a possibility. And that's where this chapter turns, my friend. Not with a shout or a leap, but with a man looking at the soil of his mind and seeing for the first time that it could hold more than weeds. The climax came quiet. Michael closed his eyes, breathed deep, and decided to dig. What if the thing you're searching for is already in your hands, but you've been too afraid to hold it? That's the riddle Michael faced now, standing at the edge of a discovery he couldn't quite name. He'd pulled the weeds, broken the soil, and glimpsed what lay beneath. Fear, yes, but also possibility. This chapter of our story isn't about grand victories, my friend. It's about the quiet moment when a man learns that faith isn't found, it's planted. After fixing the machine, Michael carried a new feeling. It wasn't pride, though the foreman's gruff praise lingered. It was something softer, like the first green shoot breaking through dirt. At the factory, he worked with a steadiness he hadn't felt before. His hands moved as always, but his mind was awake, watching. He noticed things, the way Ivan hummed an old tune, the rhythm of the machines, the light slanting through dusty windows. Small things, but they felt alive now, as if he'd been blind to them before. You see, the mind has a way of waking up once you let it. It starts small, a question, a spark, and then it spreads. Michael had asked what he could grow, and though he didn't have an answer, the asking changed him. He began to see his days not as a sentence, but as a field. And fields, even bare ones, hold promise if you're willing to plant. That's the secret most of us miss. You don't need to know the harvest to start sowing. One evening, walking home, he stopped by the park again. The bench was there, waiting, and he sat, the wood familiar under him. The air was cool, the stars faint, but steady. He closed his eyes and let the silence settle. This time, it didn't scare him. It felt like a friend, patient and deep. He thought of the machine, the way it had come alive under his hands. Then he thought further back to that boy who'd dreamed of building things, who'd once sketched wild machines in the margins of his school books. Where had that boy gone? Not gone, he realized. Waiting. Let's linger here a moment. The mind keeps everything, even what you think you've lost. Dreams, hopes, the pieces of you that got buried, they're still there like roots beneath the frost. Michael had spent years believing that boy was dead, crushed by time and the factory's weight. But roots don't die so easily. They wait for water, for light, for a chance. And that chance comes when you stop running from yourself. The next day, something odd happened. At the factory, a stranger arrived, a man in a worn suit carrying a leather case. He was from the city, sent to check the machines. The foreman grumbled, but Michael watched, curious. The man moved with purpose, testing gears, scribbling notes. During a break, Michael approached him. "You build these?" he asked, nodding at the machines. The man smiled, tired but warm. "Used to. Now I just keep them running." He opened his case, revealing tools and a crumpled sketch, lines and curves, a machine half-dreamed. Michael's breath caught. It looked like something he'd drawn as a boy. They talked for a while, the man Peter sharing stories of workshops and late nights. "Ever think of doing more than fixing?" Peter asked. Michael hesitated. "Once," he said. Peter nodded as if he understood. "Takes faith to start. Most don't have it." He left soon after, but his words stayed. Faith. Michael turned it over in his mind like a stone, smooth and heavy. He'd never thought of himself as a man of faith, not in God, not in anything. But maybe faith wasn't about believing in something out there. Maybe it was believing in what was already in him. That night, he pulled out his notebook. The lamp flickered as he wrote, "What do I believe in?" The question felt big, too big, but he kept going. "I believe I can fix things. I believe I can see more than this." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Then he added, "I believe that boy's still here." His hand shook as he wrote it because it wasn't just words, it was a root, reaching down into the dark. Faith isn't loud, my friend. It's quiet, stubborn, a seed you plant when the ground still feels cold. Days passed and Michael began to experiment. At the factory, he tinkered during breaks, adjusting a lever here, tightening a gear there. Small changes, but they made the work smoother. Ivan noticed. "You're different," he said one day, half smiling. "Maybe," Michael replied. He didn't explain, but he felt it, the shift, the green pushing through. He started sketching again, too. Rough lines in his notebook, machines he'd never seen but could imagine. Each stroke was a step, each idea a root digging deeper. Then came the moment that turned this chapter. One evening, alone in his room, he found an old box under his bed, dusty, forgotten. Inside were papers from his boyhood, drawings, notes, a letter from that teacher who'd called him clever. He sat there surrounded by pieces of himself and something broke open. Not tears, not quite, but a rush of warmth. It's still here. The dreams, the spark, the faith he'd buried, they hadn't died. They'd waited. That was the climax, my friend. A man holding his own roots, realizing they'd never stopped growing. He didn't leap up or shout. He just sat, the lamp glowing, and smiled at the stars outside. Faith had taken hold, not as a gift from above, but as a choice from within. And in the garden of his mind, the soil was ready for more. What if the only thing standing between you and a new life is a single step you're too stubborn to take? That's the edge Michael teetered on now, holding the roots of his faith in one hand and the weight of his past in the other. He'd cleared the weeds, turned the soil, and found the spark he thought was lost. But a garden doesn't thrive on faith alone. It needs water, and water, my friend, is choice. This chapter isn't about what Michael believed anymore. It's about what he decided to do with it. The morning after finding that old box, Michael woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The air was sharp, the light through his window golden. He looked at the sketches scattered on his table, boyhood dreams in faded pencil, new ones in fresh ink. They weren't just lines anymore, they were possibilities. He dressed, ate, and walked to the factory, but his steps felt different, lighter, as if the ground itself had shifted. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was just going to work. He was going somewhere. At the factory, the noise was the same, clanging metal, shouted orders, but Michael moved through it with purpose. He tightened bolts, checked gears, but his mind was elsewhere, sketching ideas in the quiet corners of his thoughts. During a break, he pulled out his notebook and drew a small adjustment to a machine that could save time. It was simple, but it felt alive, like a seed he'd chosen to plant. Ivan glanced over, curious. "What's that?" he asked. Michael hesitated, then showed him. "Just an idea," he said. Ivan raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You should tell the foreman." Michael nodded, but inside he wasn't so sure. Ideas were fragile things, and he'd kept his buried too long to trust them yet. Let's pause here, because this is where the story sharpens. The mind is a garden. Yes, but it's also a river. It flows where you direct it, or it stagnates where you let it. Michael had faith now, a belief in what could be, but faith without action is just a pretty thought. Choice is the water that brings it to life. Every day, you and I make choices, small ones, big ones, and they shape the current of our lives. Michael was learning that, but learning and doing aren't the same thing. The step from one to the other is where most of us stumble. That evening, he sat with his sketches again. The lamp glowed steady, the stars outside faint but there. He thought of Peter, the man from the city, and his words about faith. Then he thought of his father, trapped by choices he hadn't made. Michael's hand hovered over the page, then wrote, "What do I choose?" The question was simple, but it cut deep. He could stay as he was, safe, steady, known, or he could step forward, risk the unknown, and see what grew. The pen felt heavy, the silence heavier. He wrote, "I choose to try." The next day, he did something bold, not loud, but bold in its quiet way. At the factory, he approached the foreman, a gruff man who rarely listened. "I've got an idea," Michael said, holding out his sketch. The foreman squinted, took the paper, and studied it. "This could work," he said, surprised. "Show me." Michael led him to a machine, explained the change, a small tweak to save effort. They tested it, and it worked. The foreman clapped his shoulder. "Good head on you," he said. It wasn't much, but to Michael it was everything. A choice made, a seed watered, a step taken. You see, my friend, the mind thrives on momentum. One choice leads to another, like drops becoming a stream. Michael's sketch wasn't just about a machine, it was about trusting himself. He'd spent years letting the river stagnate, but now it was moving and he could feel it. At home, he sketched more, ideas flowing faster than his pencil could keep up. He began talking to Ivan too, not just about work, but about dreams, plans, things he'd never dared say aloud. Ivan listened, his gray eyes thoughtful. "You're not like the rest of us," he said one day. Michael smiled, unsure. "Maybe I'm just waking up." But choice isn't a straight path. It's a dance. And Michael stumbled. One night, doubt crept in. He sat with his notebook, the lamp flickering, and stared at his sketches. What if this is all I am? The thought was cold, heavy, like a stone in the river. He thought of the factory, the years ahead, the safety of staying put. Maybe the foreman's praise was a fluke. Maybe Peter's words were just talk. He closed the notebook, the silence thick with fear. That's the thing about choice. It's not one moment, but many, and each one tests you. The next morning, he almost didn't go to work. The bed was warm, the doubt warmer. But then he saw the box under his bed, the sketches on his table, the boy he'd been. "I choose to try." The words from his notebook echoed, faint but stubborn. He got up, dressed, and walked to the factory. That day, he didn't just work, he created. He suggested another tweak, then another. The foreman listened now, and the others noticed. Ivan watched, quiet but proud. "You're changing," he said. Michael didn't reply, but he felt it. The river moving, the garden growing. The climax of this chapter came quietly, as they often do. One evening, Michael walked to the park, the bench waiting like an old friend. He sat, the air cool, the stars brighter than before. He didn't write or sketch, he just breathed, letting the silence hold him. "I choose to try." The words weren't just a thought now, they were a current carrying him forward. He looked at the sky and saw not just stars, but a field of possibilities. The water of choice had reached the roots, and something new was about to bloom. What if the life you've always wanted isn't waiting for you? It's waiting in you. That's the truth. Michael stood on the brink of now, a man who'd cleared the weeds, turned the soil, planted faith, and watered it with choice. This is the end of our story, my friend, but not an ending in the usual sense. It's a harvest, the moment when a man reaps what he's sown, not in the world, but in the garden of his mind. And it begins with a single, quiet breath. The days after that night in the park flowed differently for Michael. The factory was still there, the machine still clanged, but he moved through it all with a steadiness that wasn't just habit, it was purpose. His sketches had become more than doodles. They were plans, small but real. The foreman had taken to calling him the fixer, half teasing, half true. Michael didn't mind. Each tweak he made, each idea he shared, was a seed bearing fruit. He wasn't just fixing machines anymore, he was building something inside himself. You see, the mind doesn't change all at once. It grows like a garden does, slowly, unevenly, with bursts of green amid the dirt. Michael had spent years letting it lie fallow, but now it was alive, and he could feel it in the way he walked, the way he thought. One afternoon, he showed Ivan a new sketch, a machine that could do the work of two. Ivan studied it, then looked at him. "You're not staying, are you?" he asked. Michael didn't answer right away, but the question hung there, ripe with meaning. Ivan smiled, a rare thing. "Good for you. Let's linger here a moment, because this is where the story turns full circle. The mind is a mirror. It shows you what you've planted, whether weeds or wonders." Michael had started with doubt, with silence that scared him. but he'd chosen to dig, to plant, to water. And now the harvest was showing, not in wealth or fame, but in the man he was becoming. We all have that power, you know. The world can't give it to you, but it can't take it away either. It's yours to tend. One evening, Michael sat with his notebook, the lamp glowing as always. He didn't write this time, he read. Page after page of questions, fears, choices, sketches. It was a map of his mind, rough and honest. He thought of his father, of Peter, of the boy he'd been. Then he thought of the field by the edge of town, bare but waiting. What could I grow there? The question wasn't just about his mind now, it was about his life. He closed the notebook, stood and walked to the window. The stars were bright, the air cool. He felt a pull, not loud, but deep. The next day he made a choice bigger than any before. At the factory he approached the foreman. "I'm leaving," he said, voice steady. The foreman blinked, caught off guard. "Where to?" Michael smiled, faint but sure. "Somewhere I can build." He didn't explain, he didn't need to. He'd saved a little money, enough to start, and his sketches were enough to dream. The foreman shook his hand, gruff but genuine. "You've got something," he said. Michael nodded. "I know." That night he packed a bag, not much, just clothes, his notebook, and that old box of boyhood dreams. He walked to the park one last time, the bench waiting like a silent witness. He sat, the air crisp, the stars blazing now, undimmed by the city's glow. He didn't need to ask questions anymore. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, rich with what he'd grown. Faith, choice, purpose, they'd taken root, and the harvest was his to carry. Let's step back here, because this is the heart of it all. The mind isn't a machine you fix once and forget. It's a living thing, a garden that needs tending every day. Michael had learned to control his before it controlled him, not with force, but with care. He'd replaced fear with faith, doubt with strength, survival with life. And that, my friend, is the lesson. You don't find peace or power out there. You grow it in here, in the quiet spaces where no one else can see. The climax came the next morning, soft but unshakable. Michael stood at the edge of town, the field stretching before him. His bag was light on his shoulder, his sketches tucked close. The sun was rising, painting the bare earth gold, and he saw it, not just a field, but a beginning. He took a step, then another, the ground firm beneath him. He didn't know where the path would lead, maybe to a workshop, maybe to a life of his own making, but he knew it was his. The stars faded as the light grew and Michael walked on, a man no longer lost, but found. And so our story ends, not with a bang, but with a man stepping into his harvest. I told you it would change your understanding of simple things, like a thought, a choice, a quiet moment by a window. Michael's garden bloomed because he tended it, and yours can too. The seeds are already there waiting. What will you grow, my friend? That's the question only you can answer. But take it from Michael. Start small, start now, and watch what happens when you do.